I'm Nicole Knight from Vantage Hospice. Today we have with us Ms. Kristen Schwab, who is a dietitian, and we're going to talk about some things related to nutrition at the end of life. But just take a moment, introduce yourself.
So I've been a dietitian for a little bit over 18 years. I started out in the hospital like most dietitians do. Around 2013, I applied for a dietitian role with a hospice company. All my dietitian friends thought I was crazy and they did not understand where dietitians fit in. With that, I did a lot of reading and learned that there really wasn't a lot of dietitians out there and decided to make it my mission to really support that patient. And so it is very different. We're not supporting kind of health and longevity. We're more supporting nourishing the soul. And it's become a very rewarding thing to work with hospice and helping families find nourishment and just be at peace. Eating can be very overwhelming
Right.
to us as regular day to day. So trying to feed your loved one when they're not feeling well or they're struggling with texture, I find a lot of love and support from the families who really want to know about nutrition. And in return, that really fulfills me as a dietitian.
Awesome. I think one of the hardest things when I was a case manager speaking with families is just fighting against that urge. It's ingrained in us that you have to eat. That's the first thing we do when someone comes to our home. It's the first thing that we do, to make people feel loved. If someone's sick, we make them soup. We do all these things. So, what are like some of your tips and tricks about helping a family deal with that? If the family members, you know what, I can't eat. What type of things would you
We definitely do a lot of education on pleasure feeding. We want to always be upfront with our families and let them know that eating should be always a joyous activity. We don't want to create any anxiety around food because when we're tense, we don't want to eat. So we really want to make it a relaxing situation. I love to interview families and the patients, see what they love to eat before they got sick, and then work with them on recipes and textures to figure out ways to make it easy to either swallow or to eat. Smoothies tend to work really well, and finding fun recipes for families ensures not always the most fun to want to consume, and they've consumed a lot of that in the hospital. Finding some tricks of the trade for that. And then really educating our families on every bite counts. So we do a lot of fortified meal planning with our families, meaning that we add lots of extra calories to the food items that they're already preparing. And that way, only one or two bites could be the same as taking in a whole meal. And so it helps the family feel comfortable. It helps our loved ones feel comfortable. And then hopefully continue to encourage them to eat a little bit every hour or 2 hours. And so at least they're getting something in.
So what do you think about G tubes and peg tubes at the end of life? 'Cause I know that's a really hot topic for hospice patients and families. If they're not able to swallow, what are your thoughts on peg tube feedings and getting the peg tube placed?
So we see a lot more peg tubes being placed and families going home with them. It is a personal decision. I always want to make sure that the family is aware there's no wrong or right answer. Their loved one would really like one. I would never say don't. I've learned through my years of hospice that shoulda, woulda, coulda creates anxiety. We want to let our families be in the driver's seat. I do always like to explain the pros and cons. Research has shown that feeding tubes do not prolong life, and they come with some good and bad. Some of the things I do let our families know is that aspiration, GI disturbances, and different things to that nature can cause some ill effects. And the point of hospice is always comfort and relief. But some families want to try it. So, what I do is I try to get on their level and work with our families to make sure that they understand how to use feeding tubes and to know that they can always turn it off if need be.
So if a family decides not to do a peg tube or a tube feeding situation, there are some, especially if they're having difficulty swallowing, which is it's a risk. I know that a lot of families get very nervous about swallowing and those type of things. What would you do to minimize the risk of choking or swallowing issues or problems?
So we look at it from both sides. I definitely work with our hospice teams to identify those medications that could create difficulty swallowing and increase
That's
dysphagia
awesome.
risk. And then working with the families, what food items do they really like to consume? Can we overcook them and mash them with a fork? Can we add things like gravy to make it a little bit easier to swallow? I get a lot of questions about thickener,
Oh,
and
that's a good
lately
one.
research has shown that thickener it in that population actually does a little bit more harm than good by causing dehydration, not allowing medications to work as effective as possible, and causing GI disturbance. And again, we want to outweigh the symptoms versus the relief. And so just helping families find textures that it can meet the needs of the patient, and then also offering techniques. So chin tucks, making sure that the patient is sitting upright, eating very small, frequent meals so that there's not a fatigue, and it helps to reduce aspiration.
Awesome. I think there's a lot of myths out there that people think, oh, I think research has proven that a lot of things that we used to focus on weren't always the best choice for our loved ones. One of the biggest, I think, symptoms that we deal with in hospice is constipation, which nobody wants to talk about, but it really is a big deal with a hospice patient for a plethora of reasons. Medications cause constipation, but also just the slowing down of the GI tract and peristalsis also contribute to all that as well. So, what can families and loved ones do nutrition wise to help things?
So I love to do food first with our patients. And so I find that's very important. So we find food items that either are high in fiber or things that would help them relieve their constipation prior to the medications that they were on and coming onto hospice service. So I always offer things like apple juice, prunes, prune juice. Sometimes I'll offer a prune cocktail
Oh, yeah. Mhm.
to help them out. Some other tricks of the trade are we do hot to cold. So doing cold water, hot coffee, not only helps hydrate and with that, but also helps them to relieve their bowels. Because I know that sometimes drinking fiber and with Metamucil is not
It's
the
not the
most fun
best. It is not
and
the
not the most
best.
appetizing. So
No,
sometimes also movement, just massage and stimulation will help when we're on a lot of pain medication and kind of bedbound. It is hard to want to go to the
absolutely.
restroom.
Absolutely. So, just segue into medications. Every medication has a side effect. We just talked about deprescribing medications in our last podcast and how important that part is. But what about vitamins? Because everybody loves their vitamins. So, what are your thoughts on supplements?
So supplements are great for certain populations, and I highly encourage, especially if we have an active lifestyle. For our hospice patients, again, I really push food first. Because if we're filling our bellies with medication and vitamins, then there isn't any room for calories and all of those other great nutrients.
Can we say that one more time? Because that is the truest statement I have heard in a very long time. So that's awesome. I love that.
Yes, I really try to work with families to to help understand why they would like to push certain vitamins. Vitamin D, vitamin C tend to be some of the ones that come up the most. And then I offer them a list of food suggestions that are high in those vitamins so that they can not only get calories in, but also get the vitamins that they want. Plus, it saves a little bit of money. Vitamins are a little
Absolutely.
bit
They are very expensive. What about diabetic medications? 'Cause I know that's also one of the things towards the end of life. The focus on diabetics and diabetic management is it's a huge topic because you've been doing this your whole life or for the past 20 years, managing your diabetes and making sure everything was perfect. And now we're at a point where I always say this. If I'm on hospice and I wanna eat chocolate cake in the morning, I'm gonna eat chocolate cake in the morning. That's my philosophy for that, but what are your thoughts on managing diabetes at the end of life and
for most of our patients, and this is very particular to each individual patient, I definitely will meet with the physician, but elevated blood sugars are not going to cause longevity symptoms. So, if we can reduce a lot of the medication, we will try to. We really try to manage as whole as hospice is signs and symptoms. And so, doing that too with diabetes, pricking somebody's finger 3 times
not
a
fun?
day to have a blood sugar of 150 isn't always the most appropriate. And it sometimes reduces the patient's ability to eat and want to eat. So we want to get as much food in for as long as possible because we know that will decline over time. And so, again, helping families just be educated when blood sugar is really elevated, as long as they're not having profuse sweating, confusion, and different things like that, it's okay to have elevated blood sugar for those patients, especially as the PO intake declines. We never want the blood sugar to be too low. That creates a much more traumatic event for not only the family, but the patient.
Agreed. 100% agree on that. So, going back a little bit, we had talked about just the challenges of feeding and eating at the end of life, and I one of the analogies that I use with families quite a bit is if you can imagine eating a huge Thanksgiving meal and someone comes in right behind you and says, "We're gonna eat again." That feeling of where the patient wants to please you and make sure that they're trying to do everything they can to eat and just make sure they're eating properly, but physically just can't. So we talked just a little bit about fortifying each bite, which I think is really important. So it's important to know that, like you said, you can add stuff to meals and things or to smoothies or whatever that can really increase that caloric intake, which I think is more important than volume, right?
Definitely, definitely. So some of the tricks that I use in tight while hydration is possible. Using juices and different things, it's easier to drink than it is to eat.
Ah, good point.
And so it's still hydrating while also getting calories in and really focus in on not how large the meal is, but how frequent the patient is consuming. So making sure that they're at least trying to eat one or two bites every moment that they're awake. Because as we know, our patients tend to start to sleep more and more. And
Right.
so we want to capitalize on just getting those bites in. We know that nutrition isn't going to prolong life, but we do want to just make sure that the patient doesn't have a feeling of hunger.
I think one of the difficult things about hospice and trying to shift your way of thinking from that curative aggressive, where we've got to do all of these things and check all these boxes, to a more kind of laid back approach, right? So we're just looking to see what feels good. So my philosophy on hospice and eating is, if you want to eat it, if you don't. That has always been my philosophy. But a lot of our patients and families are coming from a aggressive hospital based system. So when they're going home, they're used to hearing like wound care, for example, like you got to eat your all your protein and you got to eat, you got to eat your zinc and you got to do all these things. What are your thoughts on wound care and nutrition towards the end of life?
I know that we push a lot of protein for wounds, and that's definitely out there in the media. What we've seen is just eating in general is better than nothing. Carbohydrates tend to digest a little bit faster than protein. And so we want the patient to feel hungry a little bit more frequently. So we don't want to overload the system so that they do go a really prolonged period. We always want to encourage a little bit of protein, of course, but really, it's one of my joyous things to be able to tell a patient that they can eat chocolate cake for breakfast and see their eyes light up
Mhm.
because their whole life they've heard fruits and vegetables.
Or no salt. That was the other thing. No salt.
The one
Keep on
great
the
thing
salt.
about reaching that part of their journey in life is being able to give them the freedom to really, it's really about pleasure feeding at the
Right.
end of the day. We want them to be happy and we want them to be relaxed because we notice that our patients tend to eat a lot better when they are comfortable.
Right.
And so that's the main thing is really just to encourage pleasure.
Exactly. I think also an important thing to remember with, especially with nutrition, is there's no right or wrong. Like you had said earlier, like you can't really do it wrong, right?
Not really. The only thing that we really encourage is that if their loved ones do start to choke or cough while consuming meals, the family just takes a break anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour. We can always restart the feeding process. We never want them to ever feel like they're grasping for air. But other than that, it's really about pleasure. And I can't stress that enough for families finding things that their loved ones like to eat. It's okay to have a blood sugar of 500. It's real. They're not going to develop certain diabetes issues when they reach that spot. And if chocolate cake makes them happy, by all means.
Let them have it. Chocolate cake and ice cream. So one of the other things that we want to discuss a little bit is about how dying is a process, and that process may begin up to 12 months before you actually see some tangible signs of, oh my gosh, death is imminent, or we're actually at a point of no return. So what type of things are they looking for, and like the difference between just muscle wasting and atrophy, or is it truly weight loss? And how do you determine the difference between those two?
Yeah, we always look for muscle wasting in the temple of the head, in the head, neck, and shoulders. Typically, as our patients become less mobile and more bedbound, it's really more of just atrophy and not always weight loss. A good sign is sometimes how our clothes fit. And one of the things that we always look for too is how the dentures fit. As the body starts to lose weight, our dentures tend to get looser and looser, and sometimes makes it even harder to eat.
Absolutely.
So some of the things that we do is we encourage the families just to remove the dentures and do gum strengthening exercises if they do choose to stay on a regular diet. But if that is too painful for the patient or the family wants alternative, then we go through different types and textures. So the first one we start off with is mechanical soft. And I typically describe this as using more ground types of meats. You can easily put them in a blender, cooking our vegetables so that when they put it on a plate, they can use the fork to press onto the plate and mash the item. We also talk to them about maybe not using harder foods to chew, like bread, lettuce, or rice, and then adding gravies or cheeses, which also add calories, but help the item to stick together so that they can masticate and be able to swallow. If the patient is still not tolerating mechanical soft, then we encourage them to go to pureed. Pureed is not the most fun for everybody because it does look like baby food and nobody wants to eat baby food. But pureeing it may be an important part to reduce aspiration and help our loved ones eat. So just educating them on how to blenderize foods, making sure they use milk or juice or broth in the pureeing process instead of water so they don't dilute the food
Oh, good
and
point.
reduce the calorie intake. They can also add oils and fats to it while they're making the pureed. And that just again helps to fortify the meals and make every bite count because it is sometimes really hard to consume, especially when we're not feeling well.
How do you know when we're at a point in the process where it's either no longer safe or effective to continue to try to feed like food, like maybe solid foods? Or how do you determine going back to the different diets? Is that something that you would determine? The nurse would determine? How does that work?
So I always start with any patients that I'm consulted to see because I do get a lot of questions about if the patient stops eating, it's starvation. And I do encourage them that it's not starvation.
Right.
We have a mechanism in all of us as we start to transition, and especially towards the very end of, I always call it our journey, that the body has this way of becoming in a ketotic state, which is a little bit different than our ketonic or our keto diet
Right.
for you and I. Right. The body will know when it's time to stop feeding. And so we start to see our GI tract start to shut down. We really start to see the patient shying away from food, not opening the mouth at all to allow our loved ones to help feed them. And so at that point, I really just encourage the family to be patient with the loved one. It tends to take a lot harder toll on the caregiver than it does on the patient. And so, really helping the family to understand that this is all part of the dying process, that this is natural, I tends to really help. Now, if the patient is severely choking, we do try to do as much with texture altering as possible. But again, we always want to give the patient that right and just let them understand that aspiration may lead to other symptoms and it is their choice.
Right. So I think one of the other interesting things is the effect of texture at the end of life. So I don't know if anybody listening has a texture issue or aversion, but towards the end of life, little things like in the mouth that would have not been a problem before may make someone nauseous. So how do you get around those type of problems?
So, really taking a food preference from the family, seeing what signs and symptoms that the patient has when they do eat certain foods, I definitely take that in account. As they do get towards the end of life, chewing does become very difficult and it becomes an incredibly fatiguing task that they do multiple times a day.
So
So, really encouraging lots of beverage like items, cream soups, smoothies, juices, those kind of things are really important and become very valuable in the diet and helps to reduce fatigue so that they are ready to eat again.
So what would you say to a family member that feels like I've got to feed mom because she hasn't eaten in 2 days, and if I don't feed her, then I'm starving her? What do you say in those situations to families?
We want them to feel comfortable. And so, really working with the family to see what items they think that they might want to try. And then just encouraging that 1 to 2 bites is really a great achievement
Right.
for them and that they don't really have to eat that full meal. And just really explaining to them that this is all a part of the process and just really holding their hands. I know in hospice, that's one of the things that the collective
Absolutely.
team does together is to really hold the caregiver's hand through the process because it is very difficult. Nobody wants to lose a loved one.
No.
We want to make them feel as comfortable with the passing as possible.
There's a lot there's a lot of emotion tied to a tube feeding because and one of the things I used to say when I was a case manager, which I'm not anymore, but I used to be a case manager for a very long time, is one of the things about tube feedings is once you stop them, it's really hard to stop them, not pushing the button and saying no more, but emotionally and just surrounding that whole decision making process, it's hard sometimes for a loved one to say, we're just going to stop it. So, what type of things do we do in hospice to encourage people to make those decisions when they need to?
So I love to do tube feeding education, as all dietitians do. And so I usually start with what is their current regimen? What did they love and hate about what they were currently doing? Or do they know anything? Did they receive the tube and 3 days later they were sent home with?
which happens quite a bit.
And now on hospice, and now all they can focus in on is 1,500 calories, and they don't quite understand what that means.
Right.
And so really providing education, letting them know the different techniques of tube feeding. So it could be that they bolus feeding, meaning that they take the carton and they pour it through the syringe directly into the belly and letting them know the pros and cons. And then they can gradually do other different things like gravity feed or pump feeding. Some of our patients really should be on pump tube feeding for a little bit because putting large amounts of formula in the belly at one time do cause aspiration. But really helping the family to understand the signs and symptoms of intolerance of tube feeding. I always say just because you can doesn't mean you should. Just because they can put formula into the tube, sometimes the risk outweigh the benefit. Helping them understand if the patient starts to gurgle or wheeze, that they're really not digesting, that the formula is sitting in the chest. Making sure that they check the residuals. So if they put formula in the belly and 2 hours later they can draw back up through the peg tube the same amount of formula, it just means that the body has stopped digesting and is rejecting it. And so we always want to encourage our family members to reduce aspiration as much as possible because nobody ever wants to have air starvation. It is very traumatic for the
Right.
patient and for
To
the loved one
watch. Yes,
to
to watch.
watch. And so really a lot of what I like to do is help wean the patient down and show them that it is okay. Just as if the patient was eating by mouth and their appetite decreases, the same thing can occur with tube feeding patients as well.
I think one of the interesting things, because like you said, usually they all get the peg tube in the hospital and they're sent home 3 days later with not a whole lot of education about what this whole thing means. So all they know is in the hospital, mom was on the pump 24 hours a day, which may not be the best in the long run for a patient, especially someone that's on hospice. And I'm not used to, I say this all the time now. We don't eat 24 hours a day. So to have something going into the belly 24 hours a day and just pumping in there is not always the best idea either. So talking about weaning down, how do you do that?
I always try to I always try to lend our tube feeding schedules to our caregiver schedules. Caregiver fatigue is a very big thing.
Yes,
And so having a pump be turned off and on at 4 o'clock in the morning may not be the best for anybody.
agreed.
Slowly decreasing the rate is a great way to wean and showing that it is okay to wean and that your loved one isn't starving to death
Right.
immediately, helping them to understand as the patient begins to sleep more and they transition from an 8 hour sleep to 12 to 16 hours, then maybe they just don't need as many calories.
Good point.
Can reduction is also a really good thing because it's hard to understand how many calories are in each can.
Right.
Really having them, it's again, really looking for signs and symptoms is the biggest thing. And really encouraging the family that this is an okay process.
That's a hard one. It really is the, at the crux of everything that we do is making sure that patients and families and everyone involved really are comfortable with what's happening and knowing what's coming next and preparing them for what's coming next.
I love to educate my families as much as possible. And I feel like giving them the ability to make choices and placing them in the driver's seat really helps to make them a lot more comfortable and reduces anxiety for everybody that's involved in the situation. So we tend to be able to do a little bit more with our families.
Awesome. Thank you so much for
Thank you
joining
for
us
having me.
today. I think it's important to note that you're a vital member of the team, especially in the hospice arena. And I think a lot of times people don't put a lot of emphasis on dietitians and what they have to offer. And it's amazing just to sit here and watch and listen to you talk about all the things that, like, as a nurse, I thought I knew, but then hearing you say it just makes a lot more sense. So just so everybody knows, Kristen is contracted with Vantage Hospice and, I mean, is available to service our patients. So we're very excited and glad that she's here with us. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having
All
me.
right.